2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 16 through 21. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us this message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. A wonderful text in the middle of 2 Corinthians. It's important to remember that this letter is being written from Paul to the Corinthians. In it, he is often making a defense of his ministry, but not merely to defend himself, but often to call the Corinthians to take on a gospel-centered worldview, to stop thinking of the things that are cool in the world's eyes as wonderful, and start seeing the gospel and the humility that it comes with, the foolishness that it comes with, as wonderful. And so here we see all of that kind of coalescing, and that'll become clear as we go through. The first word is so. It's building, obviously, on the verses that came before this. And in those verses, particularly 11 through 15, you'll see Paul making an argument about the gospel itself and what it does, how it primarily how it changes the way that we see see different things. The world is what he's going to bring up here. So from now on, and now being a reference to the gospel and its work, and again, that goes back to 11 through 15, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. So we'll just put that in brackets here. We regard no one from a worldly point of view. And what he's saying here is then that the gospel has provided a new worldview. The gospel changes the way that we see things. Before it's Greek, or it's Roman, or it's something else. It's money, it's slave, it's free. But now, because of the gospel, we see people in their relationship to God. And we see people from gospel wisdom and all these sorts of things. And then he gives an example. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. So there's a break there, right? We do this no longer in this way. And once being the key words that help us understand that. We regarded Christ in this way. What is this way? The opposite here of the world. It was the worldly point of view. And you could think back to when Paul persecuted the church, right? He used to think of Jesus as completely foolish. Anybody who believed in Jesus is completely foolish, to the point where they should be thrown in prison. And he says we, so his compatriots, his buddies, Timothy and Silas, also felt the same way. Therefore, let me put that in blue again. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old is gone, the new is here. This is a very difficult sentence to understand, simply because it begins this way. If, right? And so we get an if-then statement. If anyone is in Christ, then is what would go in here. So there's your if-then statement. So this part is literal. If anyone is in Christ, all those words in the Greek are there. But this is the difficulty. What it reads in the Greek is, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, new creation. There's no there's no has, and there's no come. Which is why when you go to different translations of this, one will say, he is a new creation. Or you'll see, there is a new creation. And it's because it's difficult to understand precisely what Paul is talking about. Is Paul simply talking about an individual, a person? well, in that case, he is a great translation. But up here, Paul was talking about worldview. So it's more than just an individual. Maybe it's stepping into a whole new creation, that the gospel sets off a new age in this world, that by believing the gospel, you enter into a kingdom. And then that would be more like there is a new creation. So those are your two kind of major schools of thought on this. And the NIV simplifies it by getting rid of he and getting rid of there, and just saying the new creation has come, has arrived. And what they're doing there is just to make the point that the gospel is bringing in that new age, right? This new way of God interacting with the world. There's a chance for people to enter into the creation to come, the new heavens and the new earth right now, by becoming a part of the kingdom of heaven through the gospel. And so when you see this verse 17, and you can come up with your own kind of explanation of it, but just knowing that you have to supply the words beyond new creation. You have to make a choice on what does Paul mean here beyond simply new creation. And I prefer these translations along the line of the NIV and along the line of, this is the NRSV. He is a new creation. This is ESV and NASB. Remember that, that we're all looking for, is it he is it there is it the new creation has come? Which one is it? Because all Paul says is, if anyone is in Christ, new creation. The old has gone, the new is here. By seeing that the old has gone and the new is here, has come is a pretty good translation that the NIV does. He is, ESV and NASB, they have to put an individual person in there. And obviously they do that because why? Anyone, right? If anyone is in Christ, and then they're talking about the individual. So it's not like one is heresy or wrong or anything like that, but you have to make a choice about how big this thought is. How big is what Paul talking about here? And I do prefer personally the NIV, NRSV take on the text to say that if someone is in Christ, they are a new creation, of course, but they're part of the new creation. And this changes, again, our worldview. The gospel is transformed by that. So all of this, at least in the way that I read it, I would take this to talk about new worldview through the gospel. And then it continues. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. All this, is a reference to everything that's come before, particularly this new creation, this reconciliation, this worldview. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself. God is the one doing the reconciliation through his Son, Jesus Christ. And he gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So one, God makes reconciliation through Jesus. And then two, we are, he gives this ministry of reconciliation. Ministry is another word for just work. So the work of reconciliation, the mission, if you will, of reconciliation, the ministry of reconciliation. So what we see here is there's a tie between God reconciling to you to him through Jesus, and then beyond that, to now go and give this gift of reconciliation to other people. Now, as we read that, you might be thinking of Acts 26, where Paul talks to Agrippa and talks about how he was called to bring the light to the Gentiles. Now, Paul might be saying God gave us the ministry of reconciliation and referring to that moment when Jesus appeared to him on the Damascus Road and did all these things. But I don't think that's what's going on. I think Paul's actually intentionally not making use of that. If you go back up to 11 through 15, you'll see that what he's talking about is the same gospel that we've all received. I think Paul's basis for the reception of this ministry of reconciliation simply comes from being reconciled to God himself. And if you are in Christ, If you are part of the new creation, if you've been reconciled to God, then you too have some stake, some reception in this ministry of reconciliation. And then Paul defines the ministry of reconciliation, the message really, that God was. So then you get this ministry here. And in this next section, God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ. And that's, so now we get through, we get in, and all these different prepositions to help us understand, through, in, with Christ, in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, right? This is the issue, that man has sinned against God. And so God is not counting people's sins against them, right? How? Through Christ, or in Christ, through his death, right? And that's what he gets to the end. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. So there's a tie there. But back to 19. Not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation, which is just a retelling of verse 18 down here in verse 19. But again, I think that if we're understanding this right, is that when people are reconciled to God, he commits unto them. They are now responsible for the message of reconciliation. And this is important because Paul's still talking about him and his friends, right? Or you could even ask that question, who is the we? Paul, am I included in the we? And I think at the first glance, and we need to understand that Paul is primarily talking about, as Christ's ambassadors, these people with the ministry of reconciliation. I'll highlight that. We're getting too much black in here. It's not clear anymore. There's a link here between having the ministry of reconciliation and being Christ's ambassadors. And when he says we, I think primarily he's talking about him and his buddies. But I think that at the same time, this applies to anyone who's received the gospel, that we have also been committed with the message of reconciliation. We've been given a ministry of reconciliation, and therefore we can all learn from this, and we all realize that this is actually all who've been reconciled. That Paul is really leading by example here, and he's showing that when you've been reconciled to God, that you are now a steward of this gospel. You have been given a candle. Do not cover it up. Use it to bring light. And he says this: we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. And this is really interesting. The ambassador in the New Testament era was sent from the weaker country to the stronger country in order to make peace so that war could be avoided. But in the kingdom of heaven, it is the stronger, so this is the world, but in heaven, the stronger one, God, sends ambassadors to the weaker ones, us, in order for there to be peace, right? And so once again, it's an example of, in the world's worldview, this is weird. But when we understand what God is doing, it makes sense. God is making an appeal to a world that has sin against him. And he's saying, I won't hold your sin against you if you will come to me in and through Christ. God is imploring the world to accept his peace so that they won't have to feel his wrath. So then he does this wonderful thing. As you know, there's no commands in this, but the closest thing is right here. We implore you on God's behalf, be reconciled to God. And this gets back to the Corinthian issue, which is, they're really rejecting Paul, but not just Paul. They're really rejecting the worldview that the gospel provides. They want to live in the world's worldview and not in heaven's. And so Paul is begging them, be reconciled to God, which reminds us that, yes, God is making an appeal to a broken, lost world. But then even within the church, when a Christian is not walking with the Lord, when they're sinning, when they're living in disobedience to God, when they don't have God's view of the world and they have their own view of the world, we implore, we beg, be reconciled to God. Get right with God. Walk with him again. And then, of course, so let me give this section now. This is the reconciling leads to being an ambassador. You can't see that, I'm sorry. But reconciling kind of leads to being an ambassador in those verses. And then the final section here is just a retelling of the gospel. Just to ground it all back down again, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. There is no righteousness apart from being in Christ Jesus. What does God do to make all this possible? Him who had no sin, that is Jesus, became sin for us. And obviously he dies for that, but is raised to life. And in him now we can also have the righteousness of God. So that's 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 16 through 21. And in it, we discover that through the gospel, we're imparted with a new worldview. We are a new creation. We have been reconciled. And as recipients of a reconciling message, we have the responsibility to, as ambassadors, go into this world and share the message of reconciliation.